Night has fallen, and tonight our journey carries us back more than 5 centuries to a voyage that would quietly reshape the course of history, when a Portuguese fleet crossed the Atlantic expecting the riches of India but instead reached a coastline no European expedition had ever officially described. Was this astonishing encounter nothing more than a twist of fate, or had the ocean been guarding a secret that a handful of navigators already suspected? Imagine standing aboard a wooden flagship in the year 1500, surrounded by an endless horizon where every sunrise looked identical to the last and every passing day carried the weight of uncertainty, while stories of unknown seas still lingered in the minds of experienced sailors. Beyond that immense stretch of water waited an answer no one on deck could fully predict, and the decisions made during those silent weeks would echo through centuries of human history. Before we follow those ships into the vast Atlantic, we must first understand why the Kingdom of Portugal was willing to risk fortunes, lives, and its greatest captains in pursuit of a route that seemed almost impossible, because only then does the true significance of what happened become impossible to ignore. And once that larger picture begins to emerge, another question naturally follows. Were they really searching for only one destination, or had history been quietly moving toward a very different shore all along? By the closing years of the 15th century, Europe was changing faster than most people could imagine, yet one obstacle continued to frustrate every ambitious kingdom. The wealth of the East remained separated from the West by long and expensive trade networks controlled by powerful intermediaries. Every shipment of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and precious fabrics crossed countless hands before reaching European markets, driving prices ever higher and convincing one small kingdom that the greatest fortunes would belong to whoever discovered a direct path across the sea. Portugal stood at the western edge of Europe, facing the Atlantic instead of the great continental trade routes, and what once appeared to be a geographic disadvantage gradually became its greatest strength. Generation after generation, its rulers invested in ships, navigation, astronomy, and cartography, believing that patient exploration could succeed where armies and merchants had failed. But could anyone truly know where that relentless search would eventually lead? Each expedition ventured a little farther than the last, returning not only with goods but with something even more valuable: knowledge. Every current that was mapped, every favorable wind that was recorded, and every dangerous stretch of coastline that was carefully described transformed experience into strategy, laying the invisible foundation for a voyage that would one day reveal far more than anyone had officially set out to find. Long before Pedro Álvares Cabral received command of the expedition, Portuguese mariners had spent decades pushing beyond the familiar coastline of Africa, accepting storms, uncertainty, and repeated failure in exchange for fragments of knowledge that slowly revealed the rhythm of the Atlantic. Each successful voyage expanded the kingdom's confidence, proving that the ocean was not an endless barrier but a vast network of winds and currents waiting to be understood, although every new discovery seemed to raise an even greater question about what still remained beyond the horizon. One breakthrough changed everything when Bartolomé Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, demonstrating that the continent could indeed be circumnavigated and that the waters leading toward the Indian Ocean were no longer the domain of speculation alone. His achievement did not immediately deliver the riches Portugal desired, but it transformed a distant dream into a practical objective, encouraging the crown to prepare an expedition capable of completing the route that generations had struggled to uncover. That final step arrived with Vasco da Gama, whose remarkable voyage established the first direct maritime connection between Europe and India, opening commercial possibilities that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations despite enormous losses suffered along the way. The success convinced King Manuel I that the moment had come not merely to repeat the journey but to expand it on an unprecedented scale, a decision that would soon place one noble commander at the center of an expedition remembered for a destination no official plan had ever announced. Pedro Álvares Cabral was not chosen solely because of his noble birth, nor because he possessed unmatched experience at sea, but because he represented the kind of leader the Portuguese crown believed could balance authority, diplomacy, and discipline during a mission whose success depended on far more than navigation alone. He would command seasoned captains, negotiate with distant rulers, protect royal interests, and carry the prestige of Portugal across oceans that still concealed more mysteries than certainties. The fleet assembled for this undertaking reflected ambitions unlike any Portugal had pursued before, with large ocean-going vessels prepared for many months at sea and crews composed of sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, priests, interpreters, and royal officials, each assigned a role essential to the expedition's success. Every barrel loaded onto the ships, every chart carefully reviewed, and every order delivered before departure revealed that this was not simply another voyage, but the beginning of a campaign intended to establish a lasting Portuguese presence across the eastern trade routes, although fate would soon interrupt those carefully designed plans. When the fleet finally sailed from Lisbon in March of 1500, thousands watched the ships disappear beyond the mouth of the Tagus River, aware that many of the men standing on those decks might never return home. No one gathered along the shoreline could have imagined that before reaching India, those same sails would appear before an entirely different coast, setting in motion one of the most consequential encounters in the history of the Atlantic world, and raising a question that historians continue to debate more than 5 centuries later. Was the course they followed driven entirely by the wind, or by intentions hidden beneath the surface of official history? The first stage of the voyage unfolded much as Portugal's navigators had expected, carrying the fleet southwest across familiar waters toward the Canary Islands before continuing to the Cape Verde archipelago, the final reliable stopping point before the immense Atlantic crossing. Conditions remained favorable, the ships held formation with practiced precision, and daily life settled into the disciplined rhythm of watches, maintenance, prayers and careful rationing, giving every impression that the expedition would simply repeat the successful route established only a few years earlier. Everything changed after leaving Cape Verde, when Cabral directed the fleet farther west instead of remaining closer to the African coastline, a decision that has fascinated historians ever since because it marked the moment where certainty gave way to enduring mystery. Was he merely applying advanced navigational knowledge to capture stronger winds and ocean currents? Or had the Portuguese crown quietly instructed him to investigate lands believed to exist beyond the known sea, trusting that opportunity and strategy might meet along the same horizon? 4 weeks the ships sailed across open water with nothing to interrupt the endless meeting of sky and ocean, while experienced pilots relied on the stars, the sun and the behavior of the winds to maintain their course through an environment where even minor errors could carry enormous consequences. Then, on the morning of April 22, 1500, the long monotony of the Atlantic ended in an instant as a dark silhouette slowly emerged against the distant horizon, and with a single cry from the lookout, every eye turned toward a coastline that would forever alter the history of Portugal, South America, and the Atlantic itself. As the fleet cautiously approached the unfamiliar shoreline, excitement quickly gave way to discipline, for no captain could assume what dangers might be concealed beyond the beaches stretching before them. The sailors reduced their speed, measured the depth of the water with sounding lines, and watched every movement along the coast, knowing that a single careless decision in an unknown land could jeopardize an expedition that represented years of planning and the hopes of an entire kingdom. From the decks, the newcomers observed dense vegetation descending almost to the water's edge, interrupted only by broad strips of pale sand and scattered rocky outcrops that framed the coastline with remarkable beauty. No towns, harbors, or cultivated fields could be seen from offshore, yet appearances had deceived explorers before, raising an unavoidable question that lingered over every ship. Who lived beyond those forests and how would they respond to unexpected visitors arriving from another side of the world? As daylight slowly faded, Cabral resisted any impulse to rush ashore and instead ordered the fleet to anchor in sheltered waters until a careful reconnaissance could be organized after sunrise. That first night, while the ships rested beneath unfamiliar southern stars, anticipation spread quietly from deck to deck, because everyone understood that the following morning would bring the first encounter with a land whose story had never before been recorded in the chronicles of Europe. At first light, a small boat was lowered into the calm water, carrying a handful of experienced men whose task was not conquest but observation, because every gesture made during those first moments could determine the course of everything that followed. As the shoreline drew nearer, figures began to emerge from the edge of the forest, standing silently along the beach while studying the strangers with the same curiosity that filled the minds of the Europeans approaching them. Neither side shared a common language, yet both understood the value of caution, and the first exchange unfolded through expressions, movements and simple offerings rather than spoken words. Small European objects changed hands for locally crafted ornaments, creating a brief moment of mutual fascination that revealed curiosity instead of hostility, although neither group could possibly understand how deeply this meeting would influence generations still far beyond the horizon of their own lives. The encouraging reports brought back to the flagship convinced Cabral that a longer stay could be undertaken without immediate danger, allowing the fleet to move toward a more secure anchorage where further exploration would be easier and safer. While anchors settled once again beneath the quiet waters and the coastline gradually became more familiar, another question naturally emerged among the expedition's leaders. What kind of land had they truly reached, and what place would it eventually occupy in the ambitions of the Portuguese crown? Over the following days, contact between the visitors and the local inhabitants became more frequent, with each meeting replacing a little uncertainty with growing curiosity as both groups tried to understand one another without sharing a single spoken word. The Portuguese carefully observed the people's customs, appearance, and daily routines, while the indigenous communities examined the ships, clothing, metal tools, and unfamiliar objects with equal fascination, turning every encounter into a silent exchange between civilizations separated for thousands of years. Among those recording these remarkable moments was the royal scribe Pedro Álvares Cabral, whose careful observations would become one of the most valuable historical accounts of the expedition. He described a land of abundant natural beauty and people whose way of life differed completely from anything known in Europe, capturing details that would allow future generations to glimpse the extraordinary first impressions formed on both sides during those peaceful days along the coast. As confidence slowly increased, the expedition's leaders recognized that this discovery carried significance extending far beyond simple navigation, because they were no longer looking at an unexpected shoreline but at a territory that could reshape Portugal's future in ways impossible to measure from the deck of a single fleet. Yet before any lasting decisions could be made, one symbolic ceremony would formally mark the arrival of the Portuguese crown, an event whose meaning would resonate long after the ships themselves had disappeared beyond the Atlantic horizon. On the Sunday following their arrival, the expedition gathered on the shore for a ceremony that combined devotion, royal authority, and symbolism, transforming an unfamiliar stretch of coastline into the setting for one of the most memorable moments of the voyage. An altar was carefully prepared facing the sea, a large wooden cross was raised nearby, and the entire fleet assembled while the surrounding landscape remained silent, as though witnessing an event whose consequences neither side could yet imagine. Friar Enrique de Coimbra celebrated the Mass according to the traditions of the Catholic Church, while sailors, officers, and noblemen knelt together in prayer beneath the open sky, giving thanks for the voyage that had safely carried them across the Atlantic. Nearby, groups of indigenous observers watched every movement with quiet curiosity, following the ceremony without understanding its religious meaning but remaining attentive to every gesture performed by the newcomers, a scene that reflected two entirely different worlds sharing the same moment for the very first time. When the service ended, the cross remained standing as a visible sign of Portugal's claim and of the Crown's intention to include this newly encountered land within its expanding sphere of influence. Yet beyond the solemn ritual and the formal declarations, an even greater question remained unanswered, one that historians still explore today. Had this remarkable arrival been the result of unexpected circumstance, or had the course toward this coast been guided by knowledge deliberately kept hidden from the rest of Europe? The debate surrounding the voyage has endured for centuries because the surviving evidence allows more than one interpretation, leaving historians to examine every surviving letter, chart, and royal instruction in search of clues that might explain what truly happened in the Atlantic during the spring of 1500. If Cabral's mission had been directed solely toward India, why did the fleet travel so far west? And if another objective existed, why do the official records remain so remarkably silent about it? One explanation argues that the fleet simply followed the most efficient ocean route known to Portuguese navigators, using favorable winds and currents that naturally carried the ships deep into the Atlantic before turning back toward Africa, making the encounter with the Brazilian coast an unforeseen consequence of skilled navigation rather than deliberate exploration. Another interpretation suggests that the Portuguese crown may already have possessed fragments of information about lands lying beyond the western horizon, encouraging Cabral to investigate any coastline that appeared without abandoning the primary objective of reaching the spice markets of the East. Neither interpretation has completely settled the question, and that uncertainty has become part of the story itself, preserving the discovery as one of history's most enduring maritime mysteries rather than a simple historical fact with a single explanation. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between careful planning and unexpected opportunity, reminding us that the greatest turning points in history are often shaped not by one decisive moment alone, but by the remarkable meeting of preparation, ambition, and chance upon the open sea. Among all the surviving records from the expedition, none has proven more valuable than the detailed letter written by Pedro Álvares Cabral, whose careful observations transformed a brief stay on an unfamiliar coast into one of the most important historical testimonies of the Age of Discovery. Addressed directly to King Manuel I, the document described not only the landscape and the events witnessed by the fleet, but also the first impressions formed during the encounter between the Portuguese and the indigenous peoples, preserving details that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Cabral portrayed the land as remarkably fertile, covered by dense forests, crossed by clear streams, and filled with signs of abundant natural resources, while his descriptions of the local inhabitants reflected both admiration and the cultural assumptions of a European observer living at the dawn of the 16th century. He carefully noted their physical appearance, their ornaments, their weapons, their curiosity toward unfamiliar objects, and the peaceful nature of those first exchanges, leaving behind a narrative that continues to shape how historians reconstruct the opening chapter of Brazil's recorded history. Although the fleet remained on the coast for only a short time before resuming its voyage toward India, those few days forever transformed the destiny of two continents whose histories had developed independently for countless generations. As the anchors were finally raised and the Portuguese sails disappeared once more into the Atlantic, the land they left behind stood at the threshold of a new era, one that would bring opportunity, conflict, cultural exchange, profound transformation, and consequences that neither the sailors nor the people watching from the shoreline could possibly foresee. The expedition eventually continued toward its original destination, but the brief stop along the South American coast had already secured its place among the defining moments of world history, linking two continents whose futures would become permanently intertwined. Cabral and his officers could not measure the full significance of what had just occurred, because the greatest consequences of historic events often reveal themselves only through the passage of generations rather than in the excitement of the moment itself. In the decades that followed, Portuguese expeditions returned with increasing frequency, transforming occasional visits into lasting settlements as explorers, missionaries, administrators, and settlers established a permanent presence along the Atlantic coast. New towns gradually appeared, trade expanded, unfamiliar crops and technologies crossed the ocean in both directions, and the meeting between Europeans and indigenous societies evolved into a complex story marked by cooperation, adaptation, resistance, conflict, and profound cultural change that would shape Brazil for centuries to come. Looking back after more than 500 years, the voyage of Pedro Álvares Cabral remains far more than the account of a successful maritime expedition, for it represents the beginning of a chapter whose influence continues to echo across languages, cultures, and nations throughout the Atlantic world. Whether the discovery resulted from calculated navigation, fortunate circumstance, or a combination of both may never be answered with complete certainty, yet perhaps that enduring mystery is precisely what keeps this remarkable journey alive, inviting each new generation to return to the evidence and ask once more what truly happened beyond the horizon in the spring of 1500. Even today, archaeologists, historians, and maritime scholars continue to revisit this extraordinary voyage, comparing centuries-old manuscripts with modern discoveries in an effort to better understand the decisions that shaped one of history's greatest ocean crossings. Every newly examined document, every reconstructed sailing route, and every archaeological finding adds another piece to a puzzle that remains incomplete, reminding us that history is not a fixed collection of answers but an ongoing search for deeper understanding. The story of Cabral's expedition also reflects something far greater than the discovery of a coastline, revealing the remarkable determination of an age when navigators crossed immense oceans with little more than wooden ships, celestial navigation, accumulated experience, and unwavering confidence in their ability to reach destinations no European maps could fully describe. It was an era in which every departure carried the possibility of triumph or tragedy, and every distant horizon invited explorers to confront both the limits of human knowledge and the uncertainties that lay beyond it. As our journey through this remarkable chapter of history comes to a close, one question continues to linger just as powerfully as it did more than 5 centuries ago. How many secrets of the Age of Discovery still remain hidden beneath forgotten archives, shifting coastlines, and the depths of the Atlantic Ocean? Perhaps some mysteries will never be answered with complete certainty, yet it is precisely that enduring sense of wonder that keeps these voyages alive, inspiring each generation to look beyond the horizon and search once again for the stories that history has not yet fully revealed. The legacy of that expedition can still be seen far beyond the pages of history books, woven into the language, traditions, architecture, and cultural identity of a nation that would eventually become one of the largest in the world. Every generation has revisited the events of 1500 through its own perspective, sometimes celebrating the courage of the navigators, sometimes reflecting on the profound consequences experienced by the indigenous peoples whose world was forever transformed by that first encounter across the Atlantic. Historical understanding has also evolved with time, encouraging scholars to look beyond simple narratives of discovery and to recognize the complexity of the people, motivations, and events that shaped this remarkable chapter. Rather than viewing the voyage through a single lens, modern research continues to examine the political ambitions of the Portuguese crown, the extraordinary achievements of maritime navigation, and the rich societies that already flourished along the Brazilian coast long before European sails appeared on the horizon, revealing a story that becomes more nuanced with every new generation of study. Although many details surrounding Cabral's voyage may never be known with absolute certainty, its influence on world history remains undeniable, connecting continents, cultures, and peoples in ways that continue to shape the modern world more than 5 centuries later. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson left behind by this unforgettable journey. History is rarely defined by simple answers, but by the enduring questions that inspire us to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep looking beyond the horizon for the truths that still wait to be discovered. When the fleet finally resumed its course toward the Indian Ocean, one of its most valuable possessions was not gold, spices, or precious cargo, but the detailed account prepared for King Manuel I describing the unexpected land that had emerged beyond the Atlantic horizon. Every observation gathered during those brief days was carefully preserved, ensuring that the Crown possessed an official record of the coastline, its natural abundance, and the peaceful encounters that had marked the expedition's first contact with its inhabitants. The news eventually reached Portugal after months at sea, where it immediately expanded the geographical understanding of the Atlantic without diminishing the kingdom's primary objective of securing the profitable maritime trade with India. While the discovery attracted considerable interest at court, the immense commercial rewards promised by the eastern spice markets continued to dominate royal strategy, leaving the newly encountered territory important but not yet the center of Portugal's overseas ambitions. Even so, the existence of this vast coastline could not simply be ignored, especially because it occupied a strategic position within the Atlantic and appeared to fall inside the boundaries established by the Treaty of Tordesillas. As royal officials compared reports, maps, and navigational records, another question quietly emerged, one that would influence every decision made in the years ahead. What opportunities might this newly documented land offer beyond the first remarkable impressions recorded by Cabral's expedition? In the years that followed, Portuguese vessels returned to the newly recorded coastline with increasingly specific objectives, seeking to improve existing charts, identify safe anchorages, and gather reliable information about the land that had appeared so unexpectedly during Cabral's expedition. These voyages gradually replaced uncertainty with practical knowledge, as each expedition extended the known coastline a little farther and revealed new rivers, bays, and natural harbors that had never before appeared on European maps. As the reports accumulated, the Portuguese crown began to recognize that the territory represented more than a fortunate discovery along the route to India, for its forests contained resources capable of attracting lasting economic interest. Among the first to capture royal attention was the tree later known as Brazil wood, prized for the rich red dye extracted from its heartwood, a commodity already highly valued across European textile markets and one that soon gave the land the name by which it would become known throughout the world. Yet exploiting these resources presented challenges very different from those encountered on commercial voyages to Asia, because maintaining a presence across such an immense coastline required planning, cooperation, and continuous maritime support. As Portugal weighed these opportunities against its commitments in the Indian Ocean, another important question began to shape the kingdom's future. Could a nation with limited resources successfully defend and develop two vast overseas frontiers at the same time, or would difficult choices soon become unavoidable? Although Portugal gradually strengthened its presence along the Atlantic coast, permanent settlement did not emerge overnight, because the Crown remained deeply committed to protecting the profitable trade routes that now linked Europe with the markets of the Indian Ocean. For many years, the newly encountered land was visited mainly by seasonal expeditions that collected valuable resources, renewed alliances where possible, and demonstrated Portuguese authority without establishing large populations along the coastline. This limited presence soon attracted the attention of other European powers, whose merchants and navigators viewed the rich coastline as an opportunity waiting to be claimed if left unprotected. Reports of foreign ships appearing in Atlantic waters increased the urgency within the Portuguese court, encouraging royal officials to reconsider whether occasional expeditions would be sufficient to preserve control over such an immense territory stretching far beyond the horizon. The growing competition transformed Brazil from a distant discovery into a strategic priority whose importance could no longer be measured solely by its natural resources or geographical position. Faced with new challenges and expanding international rivalry, the Portuguese crown began preparing a more permanent solution, one that would ultimately change the future of the territory and mark the beginning of an entirely new chapter in its history. To strengthen its hold over the territory, the Portuguese crown gradually moved beyond exploration and seasonal trade, introducing administrative measures designed to establish a more enduring presence along the coast. Royal representatives, settlers, missionaries, and skilled workers began arriving in greater numbers, laying the foundations for communities that would serve not only as centers of commerce but also as symbols of Portugal's determination to secure its place in the South Atlantic. These early settlements faced enormous challenges from the very beginning, as unfamiliar environments, limited supplies, difficult communication with Europe, and the constant need for cooperation shaped everyday life in ways few had anticipated. Success depended on resilience and adaptation, while relationships with indigenous communities varied from region to region, reflecting a complex reality that could never be reduced to a single experience or a single outcome across such a vast land. As decades passed, those scattered coastal outposts slowly evolved into the framework of a colonial society whose influence would extend far beyond the ambitions of the first explorers who had stepped ashore in 1500. What had begun as an unexpected encounter during a voyage to India was steadily becoming one of Portugal's most significant overseas possessions, yet the transformation of this immense territory was only beginning, and the chapters that followed would prove even more consequential than the discovery itself. Centuries have passed since those first Portuguese sails appeared on the Atlantic horizon, yet the events set in motion during that remarkable voyage continue to influence historical research, public memory, and cultural identity across both sides of the ocean. Every generation has returned to the surviving evidence with new questions, not to rewrite the past, but to understand more clearly how a single expedition could become the beginning of such a profound transformation in the history of an entire continent. Modern historians now examine Cabral's voyage through multiple perspectives, combining maritime archaeology, historical documents, indigenous traditions, and advances in cartographic research to build a richer understanding of what unfolded in 1500. Rather than reducing the story to a single moment of discovery, this broader approach reveals a complex encounter shaped by exploration, diplomacy, ambition, cultural exchange, and the experiences of all the people whose lives became connected from that moment onward. Although many mysteries surrounding the expedition will likely remain unanswered, its historical significance has never depended solely on resolving every unanswered question. The true legacy of Cabral's voyage lies in its lasting impact on the course of world history, reminding us that some of humanity's greatest turning points begin with a distant horizon, a bold decision, and a journey whose consequences reach far beyond anything those first explorers could ever have imagined. Today, the voyage of Pedro Álvares Cabral occupies a unique place in global history because it represents far more than the arrival of a fleet upon an unfamiliar coast. It marks the beginning of a relationship between continents whose consequences continue to unfold across culture, language, science, and society. Every surviving document, every archaeological discovery, and every historical investigation adds another layer to our understanding of an expedition that forever changed the course of the Atlantic world without fully revealing all of its secrets. What makes this story so enduring is not only the courage required to cross an ocean that remained largely unknown, but also the extraordinary uncertainty that surrounded every decision made during the journey. Each change in direction, each unfamiliar coastline, and each encounter with people from an entirely different civilization reminds us that history is often shaped by moments whose true importance cannot be recognized until centuries have passed, when their consequences become visible across generations. Perhaps that is why Cabral's expedition continues to fascinate historians and curious minds alike, inviting us to look beyond simple conclusions and explore the broader forces that transformed a maritime voyage into one of humanity's defining historical milestones. And as we leave the shores of the year 1500 behind, one thought remains impossible to ignore. Somewhere between careful planning, remarkable skill, and the unpredictable power of the Atlantic, a single voyage opened the door to a new chapter in world history whose legacy still surrounds us today. Even after centuries of research, the voyage of 1500 continues to remind us that history is rarely built from certainty alone, but from fragments of evidence carefully assembled across generations. Every preserved manuscript, every navigational chart, and every surviving testimony offers another opportunity to understand how a mission intended to reach the East unexpectedly introduced Europe to a vast land that would eventually become one of the world's largest nations. The Atlantic Ocean that once appeared as an immense barrier has since become a bridge connecting peoples, cultures, and economies, yet in Cabral's time it represented one of humanity's greatest unknown frontiers. The men who crossed those waters possessed neither modern instruments nor complete maps, relying instead on accumulated experience, careful observation, and extraordinary confidence in their ability to navigate an ocean that still concealed countless dangers beyond the visible horizon. As we reflect on this remarkable journey, perhaps the most enduring lesson lies not only in the discovery itself, but in humanity's relentless desire to explore what remains beyond the limits of current knowledge. That same spirit of curiosity continues to inspire historians, researchers, and explorers today, proving that although the ships of 1500 have long since disappeared, the questions they left behind still invite us to venture beyond the horizon in search of answers that history has yet to fully reveal. For more than 500 years, the story of Cabral's expedition has continued to inspire debate not because every answer has been found, but because each generation uncovers new ways of interpreting the evidence left behind. Historical investigation is a constantly evolving process, where familiar documents are revisited with fresh perspectives and new technologies reveal details that earlier scholars could never have examined, ensuring that the voyage remains an active field of research rather than a chapter permanently closed. The remarkable endurance of this story also reflects the extraordinary achievements of the Age of Discovery, when determination, experience, and innovation allowed relatively small kingdoms to cross oceans that had once seemed impossible to navigate. Behind every successful expedition stood thousands of people whose work often remained invisible, from shipbuilders and cartographers to astronomers, craftsmen, merchants, and sailors, each contributing to a chain of knowledge that made long-distance exploration increasingly possible despite the immense risks involved. As the centuries continue to pass, the voyage of 1500 remains both a historical milestone and a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge has always depended on the courage to venture beyond what is already known. Perhaps that is why this remarkable expedition still captures our imagination today, inviting us to look beyond the familiar horizon and remember that every great discovery begins with a single decision to sail toward the unknown. Standing on the shoreline today, it is difficult to imagine the uncertainty that surrounded the Atlantic in the year 1500, when its vast waters represented not a familiar passage but one of the greatest challenges humanity had ever attempted to overcome. Every league sailed into the unknown demanded courage, discipline, and unwavering trust in knowledge that was still being built voyage after voyage, reminding us that the maps of the world were expanded not in a single moment but through countless decisions made by those willing to continue beyond the visible horizon. The arrival of Cabral's fleet did not bring an end to exploration. Instead, it marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter whose consequences would unfold over centuries rather than days. Political ambitions, commercial interests, scientific advances, cultural encounters, and human experiences gradually became intertwined, creating a story far more complex than any single expedition could have revealed during those first peaceful days along the Brazilian coast. Perhaps that is the greatest reason this voyage continues to captivate us after more than 5 centuries, because it reminds us that history is not simply a record of destinations reached, but of journeys undertaken despite uncertainty. And as we leave this remarkable chapter behind, one final thought remains. Beyond every horizon explored by those sailors lay another still waiting to be discovered, proving that humanity's greatest achievements have always begun with the courage to sail toward the unknown. Even now, when satellites can map every coastline and technology allows us to cross oceans in a matter of hours, the voyage of Pedro Álvares Cabral continues to command attention because it belongs to a time when every decision at sea carried consequences that could alter the course of history. The men who sailed westward had no certainty of what awaited them beyond the horizon, relying instead on experience, discipline, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of navigators who had gradually transformed the Atlantic from an unknown frontier into a navigable ocean. The discoveries made during that remarkable age were never the achievement of a single expedition alone, but the result of decades of persistence, observation, and continuous refinement of maritime knowledge. Each successful voyage built upon those that came before it, allowing later captains to venture farther with greater confidence while still confronting the unpredictable forces of nature that no chart or instrument could ever fully control. Perhaps that is why this journey continues to resonate after more than 5 centuries, reminding us that the greatest chapters of history are often written by people willing to accept uncertainty in pursuit of something they cannot yet see. And although the ships that crossed the Atlantic in 1500 have long since vanished into the past, the questions they left behind continue to inspire every generation that looks toward the horizon and wonders what other stories remain waiting to be discovered. The story of Cabral's expedition reminds us that history is not preserved only in monuments or ancient documents, but also in the questions that continue to challenge every generation of researchers. Each new study, each carefully examined archive, and each rediscovered source encourages historians to revisit familiar events with fresh eyes, revealing that even the best-known chapters of the past can still hold unexpected insights waiting to emerge. What began as a royal expedition intended to strengthen Portugal's position within the lucrative trade of the East ultimately reshaped the history of the Atlantic in ways no one standing aboard those ships could have imagined. The encounter with the Brazilian coast marked the beginning of centuries of political, economic, cultural, and social developments that extended far beyond the ambitions of the original voyage, demonstrating how a single moment at sea can influence the destiny of millions across generations. As our exploration of this extraordinary journey draws closer to its conclusion, one enduring truth remains impossible to ignore. The Age of Discovery was never simply about reaching new lands, but about expanding humanity's understanding of the world itself. And perhaps that is why the Voyage of 1500 continues to inspire curiosity today, inviting us to return once more to the Atlantic horizon, where certainty gave way to possibility and where one unexpected coastline quietly changed the course of history forever. Looking back across more than 5 centuries, it becomes clear that the voyage of Pedro Álvares Cabral was shaped by a remarkable combination of preparation, experience and circumstances that no one could fully predict before the fleet left Lisbon. Every decision made along the way, from the careful planning of the expedition to the choices taken on the open sea, contributed to a sequence of events whose historical importance would only become fully understood long after the last sail disappeared beyond the Atlantic horizon. The coastline first sighted in April 1500 would eventually become the setting for one of the world's most diverse societies, where indigenous traditions, Portuguese influence and countless later contributions combined over generations to create a rich cultural heritage unlike any other. Although the people who witnessed those first peaceful encounters could not foresee the centuries that lay ahead, their meeting marked the opening of a historical process whose influence would extend across continents and continue shaping the modern world in countless visible and invisible ways. Perhaps that is the enduring power of this extraordinary story, because it reminds us that history is not only the record of what happened, but also the memory of moments when the future quietly began to change without anyone fully realizing it. And as the Atlantic continues to separate and unite nations just as it did more than 500 years ago, the Voyage of 1500 remains a timeless invitation to explore the unknown, to question accepted narratives, and to appreciate how a single journey can leave an echo that lasts through the centuries. Even after every surviving document has been examined and every known route carefully reconstructed, the Voyage of 1500 continues to resist simple conclusions, reminding us that the past often preserves its greatest mysteries alongside its most celebrated achievements. History can illuminate the decisions that were made, explain the political ambitions that motivated them, and trace the consequences that followed, yet it also leaves room for questions whose answers may never be recovered with complete certainty. Perhaps that uncertainty is precisely what has allowed Cabral's expedition to endure as one of the defining stories of the Age of Discovery, inviting each new generation to reconsider the evidence rather than merely accept established interpretations. Every historian who studies the surviving records, every researcher who compares ancient charts with modern analysis, and every reader who follows this remarkable journey becomes part of an ongoing conversation that has continued for more than 5 centuries without ever truly reaching its final chapter. As we step away from the decks of those weathered ships and leave the Atlantic of the 16th century behind, one image remains impossible to forget: a